So, today I want to talk about a woman being charged with a hate crime against the police. Yes, you did indeed hear this correctly. A woman was charged with a hate crime enhancement on her charges because she's said to have intimidated a police officer by defacing a Back the Blue sign in front of said officer. This is an absurd use of a hate crime enhancement on a charge as far as I'm concerned. Now, I do need to point out that none of this should be taken as legal advice. However, what I do hope to do today is to share some of the information I was able to find about this particular case, and then explain to you why I do not think that a police officer should be put under the protections of a hate crime as we typically think of them. Now, the fact that I have to do this feels kind of absurd, but I guess this is where we're at. Now, from what I was able to find about this particular case, it seems that the person being charged was in a vehicle that was pulled over for a traffic violation. Nobody received a ticket, however, a verbal warning was issued. The young woman in question proceeded to return to the location later with a sign and allegedly destroyed it in front of the officer. This is what warrants a hate crime in the state of Utah against a police officer, apparently. So let's take a look at some of the information available about the rest of this story. So a Utah hate crime case is drawing national attention after local authorities charged a young woman with a hate crime over allegedly defacing a Back the Blue sign in front of a sheriff's deputy. Now, it needs to be noted that Utah is one of 5 states, along with Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, and New Hampshire, that list law enforcement officers alongside things like race and gender in their hate crime laws as protected categories. This is absurd, and as I will cover, this really doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't fit with the definitions of things like race and gender that are typically thought of as needing protection as opposed to something like a law enforcement officer. But we'll get to that near the end of the video. Now, the woman in question is accused of stomping on a Back the Blue sign while, quote, smirking in an intimidating manner at a Garfield County Sheriff's deputy. The deputy had pulled over a group of vehicles for speeding, the sheriff's office says. Now, one of the things that I need to call into question right away is how it is that a police officer who has a gun, who has protections from the state, both with the forms of immunity that are often granted to police officers, in addition to the ways that the state typically protects their actions, could be intimidated by a woman smirking in an intimidating manner. That isn't to say that smirking can't be intimidating, or that there can't be an abuse of power via something like that. But what I'm getting at is somebody who already has state protections, who's carrying a gun. How is it that breaking a sign in front of them while smirking is in any way intimidating to said officer? To me, that makes no sense. Now, the officer wrote in court documents that the incident should be treated as a hate crime because it was an attempt to intimidate law enforcement. Now, there's a lot of burden of proof on that, even if we consider the law being what it is. You have to be able to prove that it was specifically because he was a member of law enforcement and not because he himself was just being a jerk to them in the vehicle, for example, or that it was specifically this individual. Now, it again becomes very absurd to even try to differentiate that, given that his profession, again, gives him certain immunities and protections already, that makes it such that just breaking a sign in front of him isn't even necessarily intimidating in the first place, let alone a version of a hate crime and intimidating in the manner that we'll come to address. Now, the local sheriff is, of course, defending the charges. The police are going to back their own. That's typically what happens. We are greatly disturbed, according to the sheriff's department, by the hatred shown to law enforcement officers for no apparent reason. Now, I think there's a lot of reason why people might, show some hatred towards law enforcement. There's a number of reasons involving the amount of power they have compared to the average citizen, in addition to the political climate that we are in and the arbitrary nature of a lot of offenses that are put against people. Now, I'm not saying that is applicable in this particular case, but there are, again, political reasons why the police have come under scrutiny as of late. And that is worth noting. It's not for no apparent reason. There are reasons why people might be genuinely upset with the police, especially the way they can talk to people, the way they can dismiss people, the way they can demean people, and get away with it without any sort of legal repercussions. And that's not even applying all of the other political factors that come into this in recent years, especially, but pretty much throughout the existence of the institution of policing in the United States. Now, alleging that the woman was extremely aggressive and violent towards the deputy, Miss Gibson caused a public disturbance in particular and purposefully targeted the officer in a very unpeaceful manner. Now, again, it brings up this question about what is unpeaceful. When we're talking about this, there was a destruction of property that happened, sure. And given that the police's job is mainly to protect property, it makes sense that she ended up getting arrested for breaking said property in front of the officer. Again, that is very apparent that that was going to happen. However, there's no violence that was committed by breaking a sign and smirking, and certainly not against somebody who, again, has state protection. This is, again, an absurd reading of a hate crime that seems arbitrary and seems to be an abuse of power. There is no other instance where the person who is the victim of a hate crime or survived a hate crime can create the law around it and subject the other person to saying, well, you did this to me, therefore it's a hate crime. Usually that's left to police and legal discretion. However, in this instance, if we're dealing with a law enforcement officer, that law enforcement officer ends up becoming the person who's deeming the charge as well as the victim of the crime. And that seems to be an absurd abuse of power in addition to everything else at play. Now, the ACLU has said that this case sends a chilling message. Under Utah state hate crime laws, a person can be convicted of a hate crime if found to have committed an offense with the intent to intimidate or terrorize another person, or with reason to believe that this action would intimidate or terrorize that person. Now, this is not how most other places deal with that. Critics say that the Utah case is proof that including police and hate crime laws actually opens the door to undermining dissent and the right to free speech. If you can protest against a police officer and then be told, well, you don't agree with the police and therefore this is a hate crime, that again seems to be an arbitrary abuse of power. As is most cases with the police in a lot of these instances where they get to have the definitions and control whether or not a charge sticks or not. Yeah, of course it does go to the courts, but a lot of that is all tied together. Now, this kind of charge decision sends an extremely chilling message to the community that the government will seek harsher punishments for people who disagree with police actions, said the ACLU of Utah. We consistently warn that hate crime enhancements are oftentimes used to single out unpopular groups or messages, rather than provide protections for marginalized communities. This case has confirmed those warnings. Now, again, that's part of what I'm going to cover in a moment, but the main reason for all of that is that these types of hate crime protections are supposed to protect groups that are on the margins, that are supposed to protect people with relatively less power. Under U.S. federal law, hate crimes are defined quite differently than how they are in Utah and these 5 states. The department says that the laws cover crimes committed on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. And I do think it's worth noting that this is not the only instance where this has happened in Utah. In August of 2020, a Garfield County Sheriff's Office arrested a 32-year-old person for pulling down a similar Back the Blue sign and spray painting in pink letters the word bisexual over the word blue. And one can speculate as to why they did that particular thing, but that hardly feels like a hate crime against the police. But again, this is the ability that Utah has provided law enforcement to declare things that are against them as a hate crime. Now, when we look at hate crimes, the way that I, at the very least, understand the law, and again, this is not legal advice in any way, shape, or form, just how I understand it. This is not supposed to be an arbitrary categorization. The way that the law defines the characteristics that are protected from hate are generally used with the term, quote, immutable characteristics. Now, what is referred to as immutable is kind of questionable on whether or not immutable is now the proper term for it. Immutable generally refers to something that is unchanging. But I like to think of it more as the parts of a person's identity that are unlikely to change over time, extremely unlikely to change over time. And if they do so, it is with great difficulty. And I do understand why immutable is used and why it has historical precedent. Categories like race and national origin are unchanging. They are immutable, especially in our society. The way race is perceived and the way national origin is perceived generally changes. However, the specifics of race and national origin, or something more tangible like skin color, generally are not changing at all. Something like gender and gender identity, which fits under that protection, can in some individuals develop over time, and that's why I want to give this more nuanced definition. But generally speaking, when a person has settled on a gender identity, it doesn't usually change that much, and if it does, it's usually trying to find a definition that fits them a little bit more than anything else. However, when we look at this and we talk about something being immutable in this way, the other factor that really comes into hate crimes is that it's meant to protect people who are in positions of less relative power in the society and who are discriminated against specifically for these immutable characteristics. A person's profession does not fit this descriptor in any way. Being a police officer is not an immutable characteristic. There is nothing inherent about a person that makes them choose to become a police officer, and that choice is a key factor. One does not specifically choose their gender identity or any of the other factors in quite the way that we talk about choosing a profession. A profession is something that one can go into, and there are a diverse pool of things that one could identify or become. Choosing a gender identity, for example, is a label that represents something that has already existed or is already being understood by the person. And that is very, very different. And I do need to point that out. And with the other categorizations, those are things that you wear literally on your skin or on your identification and cannot be changed. You can change your profession at any time. And this really has been one of the most absurd parts about the conception of the idea of Blue Lives Matter as a response to BLM. Being black, having dark skin, those things are immutable. Being a police officer and wearing a uniform is a choice. It is a choice to take on that profession. And so they should not be correlated in that way. However, it has become apparent within this political climate that they are, especially by certain right-wing figures. And that is hardly realistic in terms of what the hate crimes are supposed to be covering. As far as I am concerned, this hate crime charge, as well as everything else involved in this situation that ties it to a hate crime, is an absurd addition to a long-standing history where police and the law enforcement agencies are given a preferential treatment over everyone else. And it becomes very apparent that they become both the arbiter of who gets to label these crimes, as well as the people who are, quote unquote, the victim of these hate crimes. And again, that is an unfair advantage that they have, which can limit free speech and can cause all sorts of other problems. The police do not fit under the protections. They are not a powerless institution. And again, it is a profession that is chosen rather than something that is immutable. In no way should this be defined as a hate crime as far as I'm concerned. And the fact that this is in any way being considered is actively a problem. And the fact that a woman destroying a sign and smirking at a police officer is considered intimidating is absurd. And again, I want to point out that it's not because she's a woman or anything of that sort, in case anyone tries to go to that area. It's simply the fact that any person smirking at an officer, breaking a sign in front of them, should not be considered to be a threat to the officer. It's not like they threatened the officer's life. They didn't do anything. And even if they had, there are crimes already against police officers on the books. You don't need to make it a hate crime to enhance it on top of that. That's just going to be an abuse of authority and a violation of civil liberties, and especially freedom of speech. And I think the ACLU has every right to complain in all of this, and that this is an absurd position. These 5 states need to really reevaluate their laws, in addition to the other states that don't even have hate crime protections on the books. These don't really fit with the federal understandings, and they completely miss the mark on what a hate crime is supposed to be as far as I'm concerned. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my lovely Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.